Well, good afternoon. I hope you had a good lunch. It's me again, and after me, you're going to hear from, I guess, my boss, who is the president of the Ellison Institute of Technology. And as my boss, I can just say he's a wonderful man. I'm going to be talking about health, and I'll begin by saying I'm a macroeconomist, so I'm slightly find myself surprised to be talking about health. In most of my time as a macroeconomist, working with central banks and with treasuries, I've really only ever thought of health as a very big check that the government has to write, and that's a problem when it comes to balancing the books. But what I'm going to do from the point of view of longevity is sort of look at two aspects of health, and that's because if I were to say what I think are two really important policy objectives to adapt to what I called earlier a longevity society. The first is that we need to target healthy life expectancy. Thank you. Obviously GDP is important, but with an aging society, thank you, there's a really important aim, which is to be healthy for longer. We're living longer lives. If you ask people, are they happy about the prospect of living to 90 or 100, invariably they say, so long as I'm healthy. And I'm just going to sort of put some numbers together to show you how important that is in welfare terms, but also zoom in on what it means to stay healthy for longer, which is going to be around tackling aging itself rather than disease, and to focus on health and not disease, and a shift towards prevention. And then the second thing I want to try and focus on is that I think if you're trying to get a three-dimensional longevity dividend, lives that aren't just long, but are healthy, productive, engaged, the place to begin, in terms of the economics, is people aged 50 to 65, or whatever the state pension age is in your country. Governments going along and just raising the state pension age doesn't help people work for longer. And one of the things that's important to help people work for longer is to keep them healthier for longer. There's many other things as well, which we'll cover tomorrow, but I'll be looking in the session here, what is the link between health and keeping people working for longer, and how do you achieve it? So that's the two parts. First part is really just about the value of healthy life expectancy, independent from the economy. The second is, what does this mean for the economy and for policy? So I'm going to begin with health, and I've deliberately chosen the picture of a young person because if you're talking about longevity, that individual has a longer life expectation than I do, and so it's really important to think about an all-of-life perspective. That's going to build onto my topic about prevention. So let me now just show you some data. So this is taken from a paper I wrote with Martin Ellison, Julian Ashwin, and David Sinclair. And what we did is a famous paper in the Journal of Political Economy by Murphy and Topel, which has a life cycle model. And it says, hey, let's feed in health, let's feed in wages, and people make their decisions on what they do with their life, given how long they live for, and given what their health is. And from this, you can back out a value of a statistical life. You can work out the welfare value of improvements in health, the improvements in longevity. And you can convert it into a monetary value. So you can add improvements in GDP to improvements in health and come up with a dollar number, and you can track percentage changes. And so what you've got here on the left-hand side is what's been happening to GDP growth per capita over different periods, and it goes up to 2018. And then on the right-hand side, you've got, factoring on top of GDP per capita, the value of improvements to health and to life expectancy. And two things become obvious here. The first is in terms of welfare, the numbers are much bigger on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. In other words, health is more valuable than income to us as individuals. And when you look at the value of a statistical life literature, I think in the US, the value of a statistical life is something like $11 million or something like that. It's clear that we value life a lot more than the sum of the income that we will produce over our lifetime. It's a statement that is so obvious it's probably embarrassing to the non-economists to hear in the room, but the value of life is much more than just our income, and health is a big part of that. The second thing you'll see here is the deterioration over time. And some of that is to do with GDP per capita growth slowing down, but we're seeing a slowdown in the rate of improvement in life expectancy, and I'll come on to that in a moment, but also health. And it's useful to look at this chart here. This chart shows you for the US what are called survival rates. So it's the probability of a newborn living out to different ages. And so they go from the top left to the bottom right, and it's for 1933, 1975, and 2018. Survival rates are a very nice variable to look at, and in particular, the area under the curve is life expectancy. So you can see that the probability of a newborn living to 60 has been rising over time, and we're seeing these gains in life expectancy. As it happens, the US isn't terribly good at life expectancy gains compared to many other countries, but all countries are seeing a slowdown in life expectancy. It's a little bit misleading, that statistic, though, because in the past we've had life expectancy gains coming because children are more likely to live from 0 to 50, people are more likely to live from 50 to 70, and from 70 to 100. But the probability of a newborn making it to 50 is now very, very high. You can see from this chart here. So there's not much scope for big gains from getting children to go from 0 to 60. So you're not really getting that contribution anymore. So now all the life expectancy gains we're getting are coming mostly from the chances of going from 60 to 80 or 60 to 90. So the majority of life expectancy gains in rich countries is now really about longevity. It's about hitting into your 80s and 90s. And actually, you're seeing an increase in the rate of change of mortality at older ages. But it's not enough to compensate for the fact we're kind of maxed out for the first 60 years of life. So life expectancy gains are slowing down. But the other thing that's happening, if you look at that green line, this is from the Global Burden of Disease data set. This is a measure of the disease burden, how impacted you are by poor health. And you can see a clear gradient. Our health tends, on average, and I stress average, averages are very misleading when it comes to health, but they rise with age. And so we're seeing smaller life expectancy gains, and they're coming disproportionately in the years when we're in poorer health. And so the welfare gains from longevity, the welfare gains from health are beginning to slow down. And the big challenge is now, when global life expectancy exceeds 73, is these what I call aging-related diseases. What do I mean by aging-related disease? We could go off on a biological tangent here, and there's a sort of biology of aging field that's rapidly developing called geroscience. But here I'm just going to refer to diseases where the risk of getting them rises continuously with age. Okay? So some diseases are predominantly infant, some are predominantly midlife, but diseases such as arthritis, dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, I'm sorry to be so gloomy after lunch, but all of these tend to rise with age continuously. And they're the ones that we now have to think of. And in fact, some work I'm doing here with David Bloom, Julian Ashburn, and Peter Peart says that around the world, whether you're a low-income country or a high-income country, the biggest global health burden, health risk you face is aging-related diseases. Even in low-income countries, the biggest lifetime burden of disease is now coming from these aging-related diseases. So I'm going to show you in a minute that aging well matters, but it's kind of pretty obvious, the conclusion. Health is really valuable. The biggest health challenge is how we age. Put the two together, healthy aging is an enormous welfare issue for us. So what I want to suggest is that the biggest thing now is not to keep raising life expectancy, but to try and bring down that green line. That's basically what I want to look at. And I'm going to say that's about looking at what I call aging, because if these aging-related diseases all have aging as their common risk factor, and there may not be a single biological pathway of aging, there could be many of them. You could see that if you could slow down the rate of aging, you would slow down the rate of incidence of all these diseases. And that's going to have a big welfare gain for a bunch of reasons. One is, You know, if you've got something that means you could reduce the risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, dementia, these are 3 of the biggest diseases in the world, and so you're going to have a big impact because you're reducing the risk of 3 diseases. But there's another factor, which is a complementarity. Because if we make progress reducing cancer, and we have made progress, if we make further progress, there's still limited gains in terms of life expectancy and health, because there's still the risk of cardiovascular disease, of dementia. And so the value of reducing cancer is much less when you've still got those other diseases. But if you could lower all of those diseases at the same time, the gains are greater than the sum of the parts. The quality of life is so much greater. So these are really, really, really big gains. And what I'm going to say is that therefore we're going to try and focus on changing how we age. Now, in other parts of the conference, I'll talk about changing how we age in terms of behavior. You know, I look at my children, they're behaving very differently from me. People are getting married later, they're having children later, they're working later, they're getting divorced later. So there's lots of ways we change our behavior, which is nothing to do with health. But also changing how we age in terms of our health is going to be key, both as welfare and as an economic measure. And I want to focus on aging rather than diseases themselves, because of this multiplicity of gains you get across many dimensions. What I'm going to do is then, in a paper I did with Martin Ellison and David Sinclair, use that Murphy-Topel model I talked about earlier, this life cycle model, and say, let's think about shifting these curves and putting an economic value on them, going from improvements in health, improvements in longevity, and translating it into monetary value. This is not about the boost to GDP, this is just how much is it worth to us. And if you think about this chart, there's 4 ways of changing things, well, 3 ways really. One is to just keep pushing out the survival curve, okay? Just make us live longer. And to be blunt, that's our current system. Now, forgive me, you're going to get a bit of a crash course in English literature, but there's a famous English novel called Gulliver's Travels, written by Jonathan Swift in the 18th century. And Gulliver travels around an imaginary world and arrives at the island of Lugnag. And in the Isle of Lugnag, there are the immortals who are called Strudbergs. And the Strudbergs live forever. And Gulliver, when he first thinks this must be amazing to live forever. Then he meets the Strudbergs, and they're all incredibly depressed. Even when they're not old, they're incredibly depressed. Because although they're going to live forever, they age normally. So that's just like shifting out that survival curve, increasing life expectancy, but you're going to be living forever in years where you're in bad health. And our current health system, which is about tackling disease, is really about keeping us alive for longer, not really about keeping us healthy for longer. So that's been what we've had so far. Another option, I'm going to call it the Dorian Gray scenario, based on an Oscar Wilde novella. So Oscar Wilde wrote a book about Dorian Gray, who does a deal with the devil, basically. And there's a painting of him in the attic which ages and shows the results of his lifestyle, which is pretty hedonistic. But Dorian Gray looks young, beautiful, and fit forever. And that's a world where we don't change the survival curve, we just lower that green line. So if you, in the extreme case, you could be 80, but you're just as healthy as you were at 20, and you look like you were at 20. I don't know how appealing that is to you. The other option is to actually try and slow down aging. And if you slow down aging, 2 things happen. One is you live longer. Mortality rates of an 80-year-old would be the mortality rate of a 70-year-old, for instance. So you would shift out that survival curve, but also you would lower the health line. Okay? So you're going to get 2 advantages there. One is you're living for longer. The other is you're healthier for longer. So I'm just going to do a very simple experiment to say what's the most valuable way our health system can tackle this health challenge of aging. And when it comes to slowing down aging, there's 2 ways of doing it, and I won't go into it too much, because actually they're sort of the same. One is I call the Peter Pan scenario, which Peter Pan was the boy who never grew up. So, you know, I'm 60, but I'm still really 15 years of age. So I'm forever the same age. And the other, for the science fiction fans amongst you, is Wolverine, who reverses his age. He can suddenly just grow a young arm or grow a young brain. So at the age of 70, you just go and you have an experiment done to you, and suddenly you're a 20-year-old again. In fact, in terms of this model, the Wolverine and Peter Pan one doesn't make any difference. But the older I get, I do hope that any medical progress comes through as Wolverine, because if I'm 80 and they find a way to slow down aging, it's a bit late for me, but if I'm 80 and they find a way to reverse aging, I'm all in favor of that. So that's these 4 different scenarios. And what we're going to do is just play around with them, and we're going to put them into a model. It's a life cycle model. I make no bones about its complexity. There's some big assumptions behind it. Its main advantage is it's tractable and covers lots of things. And that should be borne in mind with some of the answers I come up with. But what's nice about this model is when you change how long people live for, you change how healthy they are, they change their behavior, which is, of course, a very rational thing to do. Now, I won't go too much into the results, but let me just quickly sort of give you the answers. First of all, the numbers are huge. Partly that's because in this model, the value of life is very high. But go back to what I said earlier, health is incredibly important to us. The biggest health challenge is now how we age. Guess what? Changing how we age is very valuable. The first example I gave was Strudberg, which is where we keep you alive for longer, but you age in terms of your health, just like all humanity has ever done. And that is valuable in terms of my model. This is a very simple model. It says time is valuable. If you live longer, you have more time. That's useful. But what happens is as we live longer and longer in that model, the value of the extra time gets less and less for 2 very simple factors. The first is the quality of the additional year of life is less because you're in poor health. And secondly, if you're not working, then you've got to save earlier in life to finance that year. And so every extra year of life acts like a tax on earlier years of life. And so in a year where you're healthy and active, you're going to have to be working harder to give your money to yourself when you're older and less well. So every year of life has diminishing returns. We've reached the point where actually further life expectancy gains really don't look very attractive. The second one is the Dorian Gray model, and that's where we don't change the survival curve. Life expectancy remains the same. We just lower that green line. We just raise healthy life expectancy relative to life expectancy. And what's extraordinary about that is how big the value of that is. In the medical world, it's called compressing morbidity. How do we shorten the period of life at the end of life that is in poor health? Broadly speaking, over the last 30 years, around the world on average, the proportion of life that is healthy has remained about the same. Which means that of all the extra years we've got, lots of them are healthy, but there's more unhealthy ones. So the period at the end of life, the number of years is getting, on average, and again, averages are important here, getting larger. So compressing that period is far and away the most important thing. And the calculations of this model suggest that actually a full compression of morbidity is more valuable than any current increase in life expectancy. So if you had to make a choice, do we raise life expectancy anymore, or just focus on bringing healthy life expectancy up to life expectancy? This model says compression in morbidity is amazingly valuable. And there's obviously a mathematical model and all that stuff, but intuitively, it kind of makes sense. So I said at the beginning, you ask people, do you want to live a long life? Only if it's in good health. Well, this says, yeah, the model says that's really, really valuable. Then there's slowing down aging. And I know that sounds a crazy thing to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it, slowing down aging. And of course, there you get extra years of life and you get better health, which is compressing morbidity. And that's incredibly valuable. That's even more valuable than just raising healthy life expectancy. So if we could slow down how we age to both compress morbidity and increase life expectancy, the gains are huge. And this is just looking at present value numbers. And I won't say too much about it, but basically the welfare gain, go back to that chart I showed you at the beginning, adding health gains to GDP to come up with a welfare number, the numbers are staggering. Now, you can play around with this model any way you like, but basically this is the answer. It's just a big number. Why is it a big number? Well, That's kind of, yeah, I'll skip this chart. This is because of these 4 things. The first is, when life expectancy was 60, when only 20% of people lived to 80, how you aged really wasn't very important in terms of your life. But when, as is the case in the UK, 50% of children born today, the government says will live to be 92, suddenly how you age is incredibly important. So this is one reason why this number is so big. In terms of looking at the current population, because the birth rate is falling, we've got lots of older people. That also makes aging-related diseases the most important priority. I mentioned already there's competing risks. And then the work we do just says this is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, because the better we get at aging, the more we value further improvements in aging. When we tackled infant mortality and reduced infant mortality, wonderful achievement, phenomenally important. But once you've tackled infant mortality, you want to move on to midlife mortality. But aging-related diseases are all those ones that increase with age. And so if you just get better at aging, there's still that aging ahead of you. And of course, if there's more people getting older because you're getting better at aging, the value of aging, improving how we age, just gets larger and larger. So there's an increase in returns to scale. Couple of points, and I'm going to have to try and move on to the macro side of things. This is really a focus on health, not disease. And we don't really measure health anywhere at the moment. Hospitals are based around disease. In my own country, the main target of the health system is the waiting list for operations, which is so laughably removed from any concept of health. I find it extraordinary. But what do we really mean by health? Now, the scientists and biologists will talk about your blood sugar and your cholesterol. It's really just about your physical and cognitive health, your ability to do what you want to do. But if you're going to try and think about keeping people healthy, when it comes to these aging-related diseases, you want to intervene before people get ill. Because chronic diseases are chronic. You can't get rid of them. And so you want to stop people getting ill. So you want to go upstream much more and identify something that triggers all of these diseases and then stop it. Now, I talked about a measure of health. It could be age itself. If you look at the longevity scientists, they'll tell you to take all sorts of drugs like rapamycin and metformin. There's a lot of interest in these GLP-1 drugs that have come out recently that tackle obesity, because they seem to act a bit like this. They work on one biomarker, obesity, and affect several diseases, not just through your weight and musculoskeletal disease, but seem to have all sorts of protective effects. But this is where the 21st century health system needs to go. We cannot intervene as if you had an infectious disease. We've got to do much more around prevention. That's going to be a big change, prevention, not treatment. There are huge socioeconomic determinants of health, which means that there's a lot of health inequality. But so much of what you do around prevention is nothing to do with your doctor. It's about your behavior. It's your diet, your exercise, the people you meet with. There are enormous barriers to change here because our health system is really a disease system. It's focused on going to specialists when you get a disease. The British poet W.H. Auden said, "Health is a subject that medicine knows nothing about." And there's a lot of truth in that. When you get a disease, they've got something to work on. But what actually is health, and how do we keep you healthy? And John Bell will talk about this later. In the 6 minutes I've got left, I want to just talk about how this then feeds into economics. This is the proportion of employment growth over the last 10 years across various countries that's come from workers aged over 50. So in the European Union, over 100% of employment growth has come from workers aged over 50. There's very little productivity growth in the European Union, so all GDP growth is basically older workers. So keeping older workers in work, and I'm talking over 50 here, I'm arbitrarily defining 50 as now my measure of age, is incredibly important, which is when you look at this chart, which is for the US, you see the challenge, and Lisa Berkman will talk more about this tomorrow. At age 50, about 80% of Americans are at work. At age 65, which is 2 years before the state pension age, only around 30% are. you can see in that world why changing the state pension age is going to do very little different for your employment. So if you really want to tackle keeping people working for longer, I wouldn't start at the state pension age, I'd start at 50. Which then is, why do people leave the labour market? I'm sure you all have your own preferred explanations. One is health. Either you have a problem with your own health or you have to care for someone who's got poor health. I'm very keen on the concept of age-friendly jobs. If you're a construction worker, it's very hard to keep working into your 50s. University professor, it's relatively straightforward. Skills may get out of date, also a problem for university professors. And there may also be age discrimination. People just think older workers aren't very productive. I feel contractually obliged in an economics conference to do demand and supply diagrams. So this is my attempt to try and explain what we're about here. And this is motivated by some work by David Canning. The red line shows the marginal benefit of work. And I've got it declining with age. In general, money becomes, the wealthier you are, and you tend to be wealthier when you're older, the less valuable money becomes. And so there's a diminishing marginal benefit to work. And then there's the marginal cost of work, which I've assumed increases with age. That could be because of travel time, it could be because work is boring, it could be that work is tiring, but I'm just drawing these two lines. And what you get with longevity is if you tell people they're living longer, then they need more money. Money becomes more valuable. And so there's an increase in the marginal benefit of work. Money becomes more valuable, I need to work for longer. And that's kind of the motivation for just sort of changing the state pension age. But to get people working, you've also got to try and lower the marginal cost of work. How can you make work more age-friendly? Is it more flexibility, for instance? Or how can I keep people healthy so work is more feasible for them? And just want to pick up on that one, which is where I think we get the link from prevention to the economy. This is showing you for the United Kingdom. Forgive me for a lot of UK data today. The black line is the percentage of people with work-limiting health of different ages, and the top line shows where the population is growing. So basically, health is becoming more important for GDP because more people are working at that age. This just shows you the risk of becoming unemployed if you have one of these 6 chronic diseases. And basically, if you have a cardiovascular disease, you're something like 6 times more likely to leave work at age 50 than if you don't. And if you leave work at age 50, it's very hard to come back into the workforce for all sorts of reasons. So we did a paper that said, what if you could reduce these 6 chronic diseases by 20% in terms of their incidence? What impact would it have on GDP? And when would it show up? Because the great problem for ministers of finance around prevention is I spend money today, but the health benefits come later. And for a government like the UK, which is trying to find money to reduce the waiting list for knee operations and hip replacements, that's a problem. So how quickly and how fast do the gains come through? So we did some work, and 5 years after the reduction in prevalence, you get something like a 1% increase in GDP. Now, the full gains take much longer to come through. You can see they're still increasing way over time. But within 5 years from the reduction of prevalence, you get a relatively quick payback. The biggest impact comes from keeping people in work. It's very hard to get people who are unemployed from ill health who are old back into the workforce, but keeping people in the workforce has a really, really big effect. In the UK, what we found was the 2 biggest diseases that cause problems were mental health and musculoskeletal. It wouldn't surprise me if they were the same in many other countries as well. And I'm very conscious of time. But it's this 50 to 65-year-old age group that is the sweet spot. That's the age where health has the biggest effect on you leaving the labour market, but it also is where there's a lot of people of that age. So targeting 50 to 65 for prevention is really important. But this then becomes the really, for me, interesting thing. What this shows you is the effect of reducing prevalence of disease in a year, but then how it compounds over time. Because if you keep a current 50-year-old healthy, they're much less likely to leave the labour market. But of course, the 45-year-old in 5 years' time becomes a 50-year-old. And if they're healthier at 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, then they're a lot healthier when it comes to 50. So you get really big compounding effects. So how, through ministries of finance, we think about how we allocate the health budget in ways that produce GDP, and how we think about this and its rate of return is going to be a really important issue in an aging society. I think the link in the rich countries between health and GDP is increasing. Prevention is going to be crucial. How do we finance it, and who do we focus on, and what are the diseases and technologies that we have available to us? So I will stop there, because I think that's my time. Thank you.
Andrew.